Alex, welcome to Early Days.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I spend my whole life chasing you. When will you come? Come home to me.
Cool. So, quantum, could you have picked a harder startup, especially with
Yeah,
Bitcoin?
I know. I really love things that are yeah, highly esoteric and deeply technical in nature. I've always been drawn to. I mean, I've always been interested in cryptography since I left the army. I had an army career before I got into Bitcoin, and but I've always been drawn to the very technical aspects of cryptocurrency and blockchain and Bitcoin. And obviously, quantum is something that gets referenced oftentimes in kind of doom and gloom scenarios, like quantum computers comes online, destroys everything. And I've always kind of discounted how likely or real that threat was. And as I was considering, what to do next in my career after I left my previous company, I was thinking about, this problem and decided to re-underwrite it and re-underwrite these assumptions that, hey, this is a problem that we can kick down the road for later, or, how close is this really? And what I discovered is that even though it's very technical and it's very daunting as a topic, it's going to become extremely relevant for not just Bitcoin, for every digital asset category, and for honestly cryptography in general across the web.
Yeah, so let's jump into it because I want to get into like the really cool stuff. Let's just go into like the quantum and the cryptography and RSA and what is it, elliptic curve and all that stuff, and just explain to the audience, how qubits work, why that is different from what we use now, and then explain why that kind of like that rapid kind of ephemeral just kind of growth is going to happen. I think you know what I'm trying to say, but
Yeah. Yeah. Let me try and take this and break it up in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about classical bits versus qubits and why
right.
they're fundamentally different, and then how that leads to breaking potentially cryptography, at least public key cryptography that we use today. And I'll kind of describe that briefly. And then I'll talk about kind of just the path or where we are today in the development of quantum computer and how close are we to achieving what I just said, like breaking cryptography. So first off, classical bit, probably everyone's familiar. It's effectively a switch, 0 or 1, right? In your computer right now, these switches are the size of like, 3 nanometers or whatever, extremely tiny, but you string enough of them together and you can basically do all kinds of complex logic that you can do on your computer, right? A qubit is a quantum mechanical object. That is to say that it's operating at a subatomic scale and is subject to the laws of quantum mechanics, which are weird, right? And there's plenty of great resources. In fact, if anyone wants a summary, I'm sure ChatGPT can give you a better one than I could right now. But the fundamental idea for computing is that a qubit can hold a value of 0 or 1 or some combination of 0 and 1. It's not really important how that works or why it's true. The important thing to note is that it kind of gives you another avenue by which to run different kinds of algorithms, right? And it just so happens that, kind of shifting gears over to cryptography, and so cryptography is based on hard math problems, hard
Right.
being in the sense of a classical computer. So, for example, RSA, which Bitcoin is not based on, but RSA is kind of the simplest one to describe. It's effectively multiplying two big numbers together and then having one factor of that huge multiplication being a secret key, right? So it's kind of easy to go one way to the multiplication of a big number. It's kind of hard to go the other way. This is called a trapdoor function or a one-way function. And, the whole idea is that it's, like I said, it's easy to go one way. It's hard to go the other way. That's because factoring for a classical computer is generally thought to be a hard problem relative to multiplying, right? And we don't have to get into elliptic curves. That's like all its own math, but fundamentally it's kind of the same idea. There's this one-way function. You do something and it's like easy to go one way. It's hard to go the other way, right? It just so happens that quantum computers and qubits by virtue of enabling these, these qubits to have a value of 0, 1, or some what's called a superposition, some combination of 0 or 1, there's an algorithm that you can apply with that architecture that actually makes that problem very easy to solve, right? So in the classical case, like hardness for cryptography in the classical case holds, and so these cryptographic algorithms are secure. But in the quantum case does not hold, right? And so what cryptography are we talking about? We're not talking about encryption. So just quick, like this is like a little myth busting. Most encryption relies on cryptography that is not what I just described. There's different techniques that do encryption. But things like digital signatures, public key cryptography, which is fundamentally what secures value and is the mechanism by authorizing payments on Bitcoin, on Ethereum, on Solana, any cryptocurrency relies on digital signatures to authorize payments, right? So that is a form of public key cryptography, or it uses public key cryptography, and that public key cryptography is what is broken. Specifically, if you have knowledge of a public key and you apply a quantum computer against that using an algorithm called Shor's algorithm, you can invert the public key and get the secret key. That's not supposed to happen, right? Usually you're supposed to see a public key, and if you try and get the secret key, good luck, right? But with this, it's very easy, right? So, okay, so that's how, so what does it mean for Bitcoin, let's say? Well, if your public key is exposed, right? Say you have a P2PK address, or you've signed twice for one P2PKH address, or if your public key is exposed and out there, as 30% of Bitcoin is, I can just basically run Shor's algorithm with a big enough quantum computer, and I can get your private key, which means I own your assets, kind of, right? Because what does ownership really mean in crypto? It's not your keys, not your crypto. If you know the key, if you have the keys, it's your crypto. If you don't have the keys, it's their crypto. So that's the concept of ownership in cryptocurrencies and blockchain is broken in this world of a quantum computer. So hopefully that's enough of a of a terrifying thought.
I think it explains it pretty well.
And so just quickly to conclude the timeline. So when should we be concerned about this? So people have been working on quantum. Shor's algorithm was written, the paper was written in 1994. So it's been 30 years now. And people have been trying to build quantum computers for that long. And, they haven't succeeded in building anything that comes close to breaking Bitcoin. The worry, though, is that this isn't a linear development path. It could maybe look more like AI looked, right? Where it's like small breakthrough, small breakthrough, small breakthrough. Seems like it's going to be forever. And then suddenly it's exponential. And I think that's the fear that really motivates me at Project 11 is like, we could be in a scenario where quantum computers start advancing very fast. And if they do, or if the current techniques that do work scale up very fast, then Bitcoin and other asset classes or digital asset classes are in a situation where this, again, ownership means nothing. And so the risk of that means we have to start preparing now. But if you ask like any cryptographer or quantum physicist, you'll get a range of estimates from 5 to 25 or 30 years, right? But I think for the layman, I think what you should interpret that as is people don't know. So it could be fast, it could be slow. But the risk that we address at Project 11 is the risk that it's faster than people expect.
Yeah, I think the most telling thing, I mean, getting prepared for this podcast, the most telling thing that I found out was even our own government is already upgrading some of their encryption to this kind of like quantum resistant. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology has first off been aware of this risk for a while. So 10 years or so ago, they started this effort to standardize a set of replacement algorithms for all of the vulnerable public key cryptography that we use today. That's based on different assumptions or different hard problems that a quantum computer is believed not to be able to solve. So long running effort that they've been working on. In addition to that, and by the way, those algorithms just got standardized in the last 9 months or so. In addition to that, they've set a deadline for all classical cryptography to be deprecated for financial institutions and for critical systems in the next 5 years. And for everything, it's supposed to be deprecated in the next 10 years, right? And so, wow. The government is telling banks basically they need to migrate off of their existing systems in the next 5 years. And so this is another thing for, I think, people in Bitcoin needs to pay attention to because, if banks are migrating, And the vulnerability for a bank is honestly probably a lot less than it is for a large Bitcoin holder. Bitcoin needs to start considering this problem.
The other thing I found fascinating with your background is that you used to work for the military. And before we touch on that, I wanted to bring up the fact that there's other state actors that are out there, Alex, that could potentially have a quantum computer and potentially they don't have to tell us anything, right? There's not like a how would we know if somebody if China or one of these other countries came up with something, would we necessarily know? Is there any kind of intelligence out there that we would know?
I think this is a great point that is something a lot of people don't realize. And I wrote a whole blog post about this called Quantum War Games on our Project 11 blog. But
Okay.
yeah, I think fundamentally the problem here is that you wouldn't know, right? Because there's not like if I had a quantum computer that was big enough today, I could recover Michael Saylor's private keys for his Bitcoin wallet, wherever they are, if I knowing his public key. And then I could move them however I wanted. It would just look to the world as if Michael Saylor lost his private key or his custodian lost his private key. There's not going to be any kind of tell whatsoever. And in fact, if you, given the knowledge of that, effectively what that implies is that as an adversary, you wouldn't want to tell anybody that you even had this capability, right? So I think the game theory around this means that you really need to, consider the possibility that we may not even find out that this is a threat until too late.
So there was a recent BIP. I think it just got released today on Stacker News, but I think it was from Jameson Lopp. And this quote a little bit freaked me out. Jameson Lopp's always been, he's very with his things, he's very just kind of out there. And so
Yeah.
this quote from his BIP that he posted, it said, he quotes Satoshi. He says, "Lost coins only make everyone else's coins worth slightly more. Think of it as a donation to everybody." That's what Satoshi said. And he goes, "If true, the corollary is quantum recovered coins only make everyone else's coins worthless. Think of it as theft from everyone." What do you think about that?
And to fix Bitcoin, you need to do two things. One, the protocol needs to upgrade to integrate new digital signatures that are post-quantum secure. But two, and this is the thing that often people miss, is that every single UTXO currently is secured, like it can only be moved by a classical signature today. So that means to really secure all the Bitcoin, it's not enough to introduce a fix to the protocol. Every single wallet, every single UTXO, all has to migrate over, right? Individually. There's not a way for the protocol to do that for you, right? Because this is self-sovereign. So as you can imagine, that's going to be a gigantic effort, which is one other reason we need to
just
start.
by you saying we need to fix Bitcoin, it's going to make a lot of people's hairs trigger.
Right.
Yeah, right. Like that's just going to be so incredibly hard.
Exactly.
Right?
And absolutely. I mean, this is why this effort is more so than like banks. I think crypto and Bitcoin have to think about this now because again, like in a bank, my bank can migrate to post-quantum cryptography and I might not even know, right? Because they transact on my behalf. But in Bitcoin, I have to do it. Anyone who owns Bitcoin has to do it themselves. No one can do it for you. That's, unless you give up your Bitcoin, right? That's the whole point of cryptocurrency. It's self-sovereign. So what Jameson's point is kind of highlighting is that there's really three options for Bitcoin that doesn't ultimately migrate. Because one of the issues that's introduced here by this fact that individual UTXOs have to migrate is what about people that lost their Bitcoin? Or what about Satoshi? What happens to Satoshi's Bitcoin? Because he or she is presumed dead or gone. So what do they do? Well, there's three paths. One, a quantum computer recovers those coins. Two, those coins are burned or removed from circulation somehow. Or three, they're redistributed, either in the form of mining rewards at the tail end of the mining curve, or I don't know, to everybody equally in some hard fork, right? Those are the three options. There is no fourth option. So Jameson has been a proponent of burning effectively those coins to do exactly. So he sets it up with Satoshi's quote, by burning and forcing those coins to be lost, it's a donation to everyone. Whereas he sees the risk of a quantum computer stealing Bitcoin as presenting basically a fundamental threat to the value proposition of Bitcoin and therefore costing everyone significant value in dollar terms, I guess. Now, it's just worth noting here that I know Jameson, I respect his position on this, and I think, but there are a spectrum of attitudes in the Bitcoin community about this. There are some
Right.
people who I've talked to who are very prominent who say, hey, look, a quantum computer is just a different kind of miner. And if they come online, Bitcoin's Bitcoin. Satoshi made it this way. If he didn't want it to be vulnerable to a quantum computer, he would have done it differently. I'm not saying which one of these approaches is right. I'm just stating that there are different feelings on this matter. And this is one of the reasons why I think this change is going to be incredibly controversial.
I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. We can get into the Q-Day prize a little later, but like that, and then to have this conversation, because I personally am kind of a wait and see kind of guy. Like I like to kind of let everybody kind of hash it out and then kind of see what the ecosystem says, and then usually there'll be one person who will have the right answer somewhere in the crowd, and so I usually reserve to just wait and see. I want to talk about the different companies that are building, just the major players that are actually trying to build these kind of quantum computers. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know Google, IBM, there's a new one called IonQ. Like what does that look like? Can you describe to the audience like what a quantum computer looks like, and like what this, like how, like I know we talked about like where it's headed and where it's going to go, but let's talk about like how, like what does that actually look like as a computer compared to a regular computer, and its functionality?
Totally different, right? So I think the regular, it's similar to what computers look like in the 50s and 60s, right? When semiconductors were a concept and, and were just being experimented with. And back, as I'm sure people are aware, can imagine, computers of the 50s and 60s were much, much less capable of the ones today, right? And so honestly, like they were up, like semiconductors were macroscopic, basically. In some cases, computers took up entire rooms, all to like print something or, some very basic math, so they weren't very impressive back then. But obviously, if you could stand in in the room with like ENIAC, right, which is one of the first computers, I think actually it was invented in the 40s to do artillery calculations for the military. If you could fast forward 50 years and just see what that would ultimately become, I'm sure people would be mind blown, right? Because basically it's like these are exponential growth technologies, right? Semiconductors, this is Moore's law, effectively, right? You just have, you double the number of semiconductors on a given chip area every 2 years, every 3 or 2 years. I can't remember what Moore's law actually is, but point is, it's an exponential growth curve. So we're at the very beginning of that with quantum computing, right? And so as you mentioned, there's several companies and labs that have taken different approaches to realizing this qubit, right? And so you highlighted a couple of them. We can go into detail on some of them if you want. But like there are a couple different approaches. I mean, some people use photons, right, to basically be the qubit. And that has advantages and advantages. Some people use, effectively particles that are super cooled in this transmon. It's called transmon or superconducting architecture. That has certain advantages. Google's architecture is this. IonQ uses something called trapped ions. There's another whole approach using neutral atoms. There's a whole bunch of different kind of physical approaches to realizing this abstract qubit. And really, they all kind of have their own trade-offs. And I'm sure the same way people experimented with different ways to realize a semiconductor until I finally settled on silicon, right? So like silicon is kind of like the way. And so then people just invested and scaled that up. We're kind of at this place now where people are kind of at what's the right underlying physical realization of this. But I think the important thing to note is that there's there's two problems that are of different character. One is figuring out whether something can work on a small scale. And the second is taking the thing from the small scale and scaling it up big. And at this point, we can, I think, pretty definitively say that quantum computing works on a small scale. And this, by the way, is maybe important to emphasize because a year ago, this was not true. And this was actually one of the big breakthroughs that Google made with their announcement in December. So they have a chip called Willow, and they basically demonstrated that you can do error correction, right? So error correction is just a way to make sure that you're getting useful computations out when you're putting in some inputs. And that had never been done until last year. And now you basically have an architecture which really the only barrier to it being usable is scaling it up. So now it's not a question of does it work? It undisputably works. Now is the question is, can you get it big enough to do anything useful? And, I don't want to make light of the challenges to that, but if the history of technology is any guide, people will figure out how to solve that problem eventually. The question is just when, and we don't know how fast or how long that might take. Quickly, because you asked another question earlier about nation states, I just want to jump in on there because I mentioned a bunch of companies, but it's important to note that, I mean, we're talking about a machine that breaks cryptography. So there's obviously a lot of nation state interest in doing this. So you can read an adversary's messages. And look, I don't think the U.S., speaking as a U.S. citizen, former service member, I obviously think it's very important that the U.S. be the first to win this race, but it's not at all clear that we will. China, is currently leading the U.S. in, I think there's a list of 64 advanced technologies. In 2003, the U.S. was ahead in 55. And in today, 2025, the U.S. is ahead in like 7. China is ahead in every other area. In quantum networking, which is kind of an adjacent technology to quantum computing, China's already ahead. And so, like we've seen, like with batteries, with electric cars, with solar panels. I mean, cars is a great example. I mean, China wasn't even on the map in the car industry 5 years ago, and now they're it's the biggest export they have. I think the risk is that they get there first. And obviously there's a threat to kind of US government and classified communications, but frankly, it's not at all outside the realm of possibility to me that a nation state actor like China may want to destabilize a system like Bitcoin because it represents a threat to their centralized system. So 100%. I don't think we can discount that at all.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's just thinking adversarially. The other thing I wanted to bring up was, so IonQ, I think they've made, what was it? What was the stat I saw? It was only a couple. They only have like 3 contracts with the military. It's not that much, but it just kind of shows that the government is spending some money with some of these already pre-existing quantum computers.
Yeah.
So you're already kind of seeing it. Yeah.
Yeah. IBM was really one of the first companies to try and do this, and they've been
19 million.
A lot of funds. Yeah. They received a lot of funds from DARPA and others. Because like, you can imagine this being of use to the NSA, right? To read Russian emails or something, right? Or someone's emails. Being able to decrypt messages or forge signatures probably is useful in many contexts. So I think, like I said, there's these 2 actors you got to consider. There's like kind of the nation states, and there's what I like to call economically motivated actors. In either case, though, going back to an earlier point that we were talking about, if you have this thing that is capable, you really have no incentive whatsoever to reveal it, right? Because if you're a nation state, suddenly your adversary knows you have it. And if you're a company, well, imagine if you're a company and you try and like recover some of Satoshi's Bitcoin. Well, at that point, just like Jameson Lopp's quote suggests, you start a panic and people sell, and suddenly the value of the Bitcoin you just recovered is now very low, right? So you kind of don't want anyone to know that you're doing that, and then you don't even know that you have a quantum computer and are doing that, right? So that's why I think, practically speaking, that's a big part of the risk that people underestimate. There's like the 2 timelines are, when is a quantum computer relevant and when do we find out about one? Those 2 do not have to necessarily be the same. And
that's true, right?
Gap, and that gap is really the problem, because unfortunately, human nature is such that people tend not to react to threats until they're right in front of them, right? But the problem is, once you realize that threat is there, it may be too late. It's kind of like, I don't know, to use like an astrophysics example, you can cross over the event horizon of a black hole, and if the black hole is big enough, you're not going to feel anything initially. But once you cross the event horizon, you cannot escape again. And so I think that's it's a little bit dark, but like kind of the metaphor here is like, once we get past the point where a quantum computer exists, ownership in Bitcoin or in any other cryptocurrency that relies on digital signatures ceases to matter. And then there ceases to be a migration path. And this is, I think, a point, and this is maybe getting to some of what we do at Project 11.
Yeah, tell me about Yellow Pages, because I saw that.
Okay, great. So this is actually a perfect segue into that, right? So, okay, imagine a world where a quantum computer exists today, and then a year from now we find out it exists, right? At that point, the problem that gets introduced is, okay, so imagine there's a mad scramble to fix the Bitcoin protocol, and it's fixed, and there's signatures, and now we have to do this migration thing. Well, what does a migration path look like? Well, first you need to prove that you own Bitcoin. And then you need to basically send that Bitcoin to a new UTXO that's secured by some post-quantum cryptography. Those are steps 1 and step 2. The problem with step 1 is to prove you own Bitcoin, what do you have to do? You have to sign a message. The message could be, the signature could be forged by the quantum computer. So honestly, like the clever adversary would just like steal people's Bitcoin by migrating it for them, right? Because that's all you have to do is just prove, that's how you prove you own Bitcoin. This is why I say ownership means nothing. So what we need to fundamentally do first, in my opinion, the first order problem is you need to rebind or reestablish this link between digital signatures and ownership, right? And that clearly is broken with classical signatures. So you need to introduce, before you fix the protocol, you need to introduce a way for people to generate a post-quantum signature that binds their existing UTXOs to this post-quantum signature. So that way, in the worst of all cases, we find ourselves like there's a quantum computer, maybe there's one already been aligned for 5 years. At least now you've generated a statement that says, hey, this UTXO is mine, and I'm attesting to that fact by both the Bitcoin signature, which could be forged, but also by this post-quantum signature, which could not have been forged. So now you have a strong cryptographic claim that these assets are your assets. Now, look, without fundamentally fixing the protocol, there's limitations to how far this gets you, right? Like it's not the post-quantum logic can't move assets. And, obviously it's at a time, specific time, so it doesn't last forever. Point being though, at least this is something. This is step 1 effectively into a migration. And so what I just described is exactly the Yellow Pages. So Yellow Pages is our first product at Project 11. And it really is just this. You sign a message with your Bitcoin wallet, and then you generate a new post-quantum key pair. You sign another message, and you basically bind those two things. And you say, hey, this wallet is mine. I'm saying this is mine, and I'm signing this message using a post-quantum signature. Now you have this claim that's time-stamped at whatever time you registered, and it's post-quantum, right? So it's not, in other words, when a quantum computer comes online, you have a claim that isn't totally arbitrary on the Bitcoin that exists. So that's step 1. Really, the way to think of the Yellow Pages is we're kind of building the first step in the path to ultimately enabling users to migrate their Bitcoin, which is what will have to happen again every UTXO. So, that's what Yellow Pages is, and that's a little bit about what we do.
Okay, so let's break that down. Let's break it down. So, talk to me about the people that you have working on this first, and then let's discuss kind of because obviously Bitcoiners, and the greater ecosystem, they're going to be a little bit nervous about doxing their public key, right? That's going to be a thing. And then in the open source nature of it all, right? Let's talk about those 3 things, Alex.
Great. Okay, who's working on it? The team here at Project 11. There's currently 5 of us. It's me. We just hired a head of strategy, and then there's 3 engineers who have security backgrounds. And there's actually one of those guys has specifically his PhD is in post-quantum blockchains, right? So it's been his research area for the last better part of a decade. So in terms of technical know-how and cryptographic engineering, that's really kind of the background of all of us, right?
Okay.
None of us are quantum physicists. The good news is to apply post-quantum cryptography, you don't need to know quantum physics, right? So it's really just basically a security engineering. So you asked 2 other questions, which is, hey, doxing your public key. I think that's, as you implied, the naive implementation of this, sign a message under your Bitcoin public key, right, is going to expose your public key. Because to sign a message, the way Bitcoin transaction is verified, you need to put the pub key there so people can verify the signature against the pub key. And the pub key, as I spent the first part of this talk describing, is what revealing that makes you vulnerable to quantum computers. So what we do is we actually, the current approach that we use to solve that is the client, establish a secure connection to a server with an enclave on it. So a secure enclave, so it's like a trusted execution environment on a server somewhere that Project 11 has no access to. And this enclave is basically walled off. It's an enclave within the computer architecture, the server architecture that only does confidential computing, right? And so basically what happens is you establish a connection, which by the way, this is the only protocol that I know of in crypto where we actually use a post-quantum connection to do that between you, the client, and the server. So we use post-quantum, like all the post-quantum TLS stuff to basically establish that connection. And then you generate a signature inside of the enclave, and the enclave verifies that signature is valid against your public key. So then that returns not your public key, but a proof that you had a valid public key. So that's basically what this registry is. This registry is, hey, here's a proof of a valid public key. You don't know which one it is. And here's a signature that's post-quantum attesting that this proof and, the public key inside of this proof, which you can't see, is tied to this new signature. But I can always reveal that later if I wanted to, right? So,
Okay.
so that's basically the mechanism by which we preserve privacy. I'll pause there. You may have a question about that.
No, that's fine. And I've seen similar things in the ecosystem just in general using enclaves, and we'll leave that for somebody else to have you on their podcast to discuss. On early days.
Maybe I'll just
really
quickly
trying
say
to-
I'll quickly say there's an alternative approach that we're interested in developing, which we haven't yet, but it's on the roadmap, of using another technique called zero knowledge cryptography, which is kind of just this concept of proving a statement without revealing why it's true. And the advantage of that would be you could do it all client side. You wouldn't need to connect to any server. You could generate your proof yourself, and that would be sufficient. I think that's better in many ways. The enclaves, I think for us, we really view that as an MVP approach, not the be all and all.
Totally, 100%. Yeah. And then the third question was around the open source nature of Project 11, about what you guys are building. Obviously, we're in the Bitcoin ecosystem. They're very much about being open and resilient and clarity and all that kind of stuff. So can you just talk about that? We finally got a sponsor. Can you believe it? Vintech. They're a legal firm out of Dallas, Texas, who Pleb Lab uses. We actually use Jim, who is this amazing gentleman, Central Texas lawyer, straight shooter, and he does legal expertise, and he has this amazing thing called Vintech. It's a place where you can get access to legal forms. You don't have to use ChatGPT to spin up some kind of gibberish. You can actually get these legal forms that are there already pre-built. You get access to his consulting 2 times a month. There's 25% off all his legal work that he applies to the network of attorneys that he knows. There's no long-term commitment. It's all for $199 a month. He also has this other thing called Vintech Plus, which is 3 hours of additional services per month, which is contract review, drafting, LLC, corporate formation, all that kind of stuff. That's for $999 a month. And it's affordable business legal stuff for startups, founders like yourself. Use the code PLEBLAB at myvintech.com and get 10% off your subscription. And a big thanks to Jim and the Vintech team for backing the builder community and helping us push things forward. All right, let's get back to the show.
Any security product, so I guess the short answer is virtually everything that powers our stack is open source. So I'll share a link with you. You can post here, and people can check out our repo for the yellow pages and see how it all works under the hood. Obviously, some of the enclave stuff, like we didn't build the enclaves. We use a service called Evervault. So I think there is some enclave software that's maybe proprietary. I'm actually not sure. But for everything else, though, from the post-quantum cryptography to the TLS handshake that uses post-quantum, all of that is open source and people can use. In fact, we actually use some of the open source implementations of that ourselves that Google and Cloudflare had implemented. And generally speaking, I've been in crypto for a decade, and I think, the security community generally appreciates and I think very much orients toward open source software as being much more secure, which is a philosophy we take too. And there have been other people that have come up with similar stuff to what we have published, whether because they independently came up with it or because our open source software enabled them to, have the same idea or empower them to, build something the same as we're doing. Great. I don't view that as a problem. In general, going back to kind of the initial problem statement, every UTXO is going to have to migrate. There's millions of UTXOs. We need to do it in 5 to 10 years. I wish 10 people would copy our stack and start doing this. This is going to be crazy. This is going to be a huge effort. No one can do this alone. So I would welcome that. And I think that's that's one of the special things about the Bitcoin community is we do these things together. We don't do them on our own.
100%. That's what's great about doing a business. It's like, you want that kind of man in arena stuff. Talk to me about the about just Project 11 and just about where you guys have come to, and then we'll jump into the Q Day prize and stuff like that because I think it's fascinating that you guys have been able to raise. How much did you guys raise?
Yeah, we raised 6 million. So
Yeah.
from a few folks, but yeah, so I guess funds spanning. So Castle Island Ventures participated. They're Bitcoin. They've been in Bitcoin ecosystem for a long time. Variant Capital, which is a crypto fund, and I worked with Jesse at A16Z, he's the kind of lead partner there. And then there was a quantum computing fund that doesn't do any crypto investments at all. They just do quantum stuff. So they were our other investor, and so yeah, 6 million in total.
So yeah, talk about where you guys are headed in the Q Day prize. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Cool. So I'll talk general roadmap and business. I'll tell you like the grand reveal, the secret strategy behind all of Project Eleven's
Yeah, because the
path to
website looks
glory.
cool, man. The website is very eye-catching. I mean, because like literally,
Thank
it
you.
literally says it on the very front page. It's just like grabs you, scares the
Yeah,
crap
thank
out
you.
of you.
That our VP of engineering, who professes not to be very good at design, made that
Mm,
whole website, and we get
mm.
compliments on it constantly. And so we're always joking with him, like he missed his true calling as like a
As a
design
web designer.
front end engineer. Yeah. Um. Anyway. Yeah. So broadly speaking, I we've talked a lot up to this point about quantum computing as a threat and as a thing that's going to make Bitcoin obsolete and as a steal value and all these negative terms. I think it's like important to emphasize that we are actually optimists about quantum computing. Quantum computing is a fundamentally new form of computing that, while near-term applications are probably going to be related to breaking cryptography, which obviously has implications for Bitcoin, the medium and long-term implications of this technology absolutely can make everything that we do online, whether it's a financial transaction or sending messages, more fundamentally secure. So quantum mechanics will, I think, usher in an entirely new era of cryptography that like Bitcoin 3.0, 2100 will be based on entirely.
Wow.
And like that's like the real future of money and communications. Like when the world is, when Earth is no longer the only place where humans exist, like people are on Mars, like people will be communicating and transacting on quantum rails, right? And that I think it's sometimes easy to get all doom and gloom about quantum computers. But like honestly, this is this is such a breakthrough technology for humanity that will enable us to move forward. I mean, there's a reason people use the term quantum leap, right? And that's what this is. So it's not just, we're not totally doomsday about this technology. I mean, we actually view ourselves as optimists, but I think we have to both future proof and future build, right? And so that's our initial roadmap, and the initial work that we want to do is really future proofing, right? And starting with Bitcoin, because that's where the majority of the value of digital assets is today. Helping to apply, not only contribute to applying these post-quantum cryptography fixes to the protocol, which by the way is going to involve many, many more people besides just ourselves, but
100%.
critically the layers of infrastructure. I think this is something that like a lot of times, and like I said, having worked in the space for a while, I think it's a lot of times people take this for granted. There's a huge amount of infrastructure between like the underlying code that governs digital signatures and the protocol, like at the node level, and like you or me sending Bitcoin in a wallet. There's just so much stuff. And all of that also has to get moved. So like, and by the way, like if you think about other networks aside from Bitcoin, stable coins being issued on Ethereum, like all of that's totally moved. So this is I'm not worried at all about the opportunity to make money somewhere here, because this is going to be the most massive migration for any software ever in history. So I think if we have the expertise and we build the tools that enable people to do that, we will create value and we will be able to capture it somehow as a business. So that said, to me, that's all Act One. Act Two is leveraging these quantum computers and quantum mechanics to build new and cool things. Let me just give you one example. Actually, I'll give you two examples. One
Yeah.
kind of more near term, one a little bit further out. Near term, something that actually has already been proven is you can use a quantum computer to generate certified randomness. Why does this matter? Well, when you think about, you generate a seed phrase using BIP39 for a wallet, I mean, that relies on randomness, effectively, entropy. And this is a very, very common vulnerability at the wallet layer. Why is that? Because creating an unbiasable, as they call it, like a truly random seed is actually really subtle and hard. There's a famous instance in the Android wallets for Bitcoin in 2014 had a bug in this randomness generator, which resulted in what it is today, millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin being stolen, right? So it's really hard to do this in a secure manner. A quantum computer, kind of by its nature, like the underlying bits are kind of these probabilistic objects. You can create a certified random number that not only is random, but you can prove that it was randomly generated, which is, from a security perspective, really powerful. You can imagine effectively a wallet that you as a user can guarantee is unhackable, right? Unless you lose your public key or you lose your private key, you lose your private key. But you know the wallet itself is not hackable. We're not, not vulnerable. That's a very powerful primitive. Again, like I said, in the year 2100, every Bitcoin wallet will use this. Like no one won't, because this is the better way to do it. Even further out, like you can imagine a world in which Bitcoin itself leverages quantum mechanics to secure the network, right? So miners today, they're miners, and the miners exist to basically prevent double spending. But there's a kind of a principle of quantum mechanics called the no cloning theorem, which basically means that like you can't copy and paste quantum states. It's not worth getting into all the details, but the upshot is you can use that principle to prevent double spend, right? So you can have a world where Bitcoin isn't necessarily entirely or at all secured by miners. It's just secured by quantum mechanics, right? But the fundamental laws of nature prevent cheating the system. And that has a lot of advantages potentially too, right? From an energy expenditure perspective, from a security perspective. And that's way farther out into the future. But these are just two of the things that we know of today, right? And as quantum computers become more mature, more advanced, as we learn more about quantum mechanics, which by the way, quantum computers will let us do, we're going to figure out all these ways to apply quantum mechanics to cryptography and build entirely new systems. And that for me is really, that's the big dream venture bet for P11, is like being at the vanguard of that.
I think it's fascinating that the way you described it as more as an optimistic outlook to quantum. Like it ushers in this kind of new era for Bitcoin in a lot of ways. I mean, initially when everybody talks about it, it's initially what we were talking about the first 20 minutes. And then now it's kind of like, okay, well, I see it kind of what you're saying, and there's going to be so much. It's fascinating, dude.
In some ways, you kind of want this to happen faster. Right?
Well, maybe not fast.
Well, let's. I think the best case scenario. Maybe this is worth teasing apart, because I think there is like a best case scenario here where.
Yeah, what's the best case scenario? Yeah.
Well, the best case scenario is development for a quantum computer happens in the open. And what's the best way to ensure that? Is to ensure there's some controlled manner in which value can be extracted. That is, that isn't stealing, but is like support. Let's just imagine a world where the Bitcoin community came together and said, hey, we're going to all donate 100 sats and we're going to put it in this pool. And anyone who develops a quantum computer can come get this, right?
Okay.
Well, now there's like an economic incentive for people to develop quantum computers. And then you see it happening in the open. So now, in addition to quantum computing developments advancing, there's an open, you can see it all in the open as opposed to before where it's totally opaque. And now people in Bitcoin have a very clear path, like timeline as to when this threat is relevant, instead of doing what they would do otherwise, which is just pretend it doesn't exist until it suddenly does, right? So in many ways, I think, well, the best case scenario is you create effectively a white hat bounty for a quantum computer, because that incentivizes two things. It incentivizes the development of this breakthrough technology, and it actually gets people off their butts to do what they need to do, which is fix their protocols and migrate their assets, right? It's pro-social in every way. Now, how do you actually accomplish that? I don't know. I'm giving you a sense of like, and to me, that's the best case scenario.
Yeah, that is the best case scenario. Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, that's well put. Let's talk about the Q-Day prize, because that was originally why I reached out to you, because I was like, what is this thing that you're doing? It's so cool, but it's also kind of interesting. Yeah, explain what that is.
I mean, well, you teed me up kind of perfectly, because what we just talked about, I mean, in some ways is kind of what the Q-Day prize is meant to be. So the Q-Day prize is something we put on. We have one Bitcoin, which we basically posted as a bounty for whoever in the next year can basically break the largest ECDSA key, right? So ECDSA keys using Bitcoin are 256 bits. No quantum computer that's known today is anywhere close to that. I think the state of the art is like 4 to 5 bits, and so we put up one Bitcoin bounty for anyone to break the biggest one. And the idea here being, honestly, it was basically exactly what I just said. You want to see in the open exactly what, a quantum computer is capable of. Now, if someone has a really good one, they're probably not going to reveal that they have a really good one. But if it's like a decent one, maybe you're going to just go for the one Bitcoin. I mean, who knows how much that could be in a year from now? Could be a pretty big prize, right?
Yeah.
And so, so I think there is creating this incentive to kind of show, or like create a canary effectively to show how close the threat really is for Bitcoin. I think, again, we're trying to do that to achieve what I said before, which is to encourage people to, understand that this is coming and to ultimately migrate. It doesn't mean we want to like create alarm around it, but again, like it's using this bounty concept to basically demonstrate where we're at with quantum computing and encourage people to, migrate once they feel concerned. So what we're hoping to do with the Q-Day prize is to make it a continually running thing. Whether or not we're going to do like a bounty every time, I'm not sure. There's a couple other concepts we're playing with, but fundamentally, like it's really in service of the goals that I said a minute ago, which is like, let's get quantum computing in a state where it's advancing publicly and fast, and ideally within the borders of the US or somewhere in the West, right? So we can continue to be leaders in technology. And let's use this as a spur to make future-proof all of our digital assets that we're increasingly relying upon in our financial system. So,
yeah. So like, how would a builder or a developer inside of the ecosystem even go off and try to get time on quantum computer? Is it something just going to like MIT or something, or just like, what is it like? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a couple different frameworks where I think Qiskit is a very prominent one. So IBM has this framework called Qiskit, which is basically like it's client access into their quantum computers via the cloud, and then you using their Qiskit QISKIT is basically the front end framework by which you're writing quantum programs, right? And so I encourage anyone who's technically interested at all to try it, even if you don't think you would want to participate in the Q-Day prize, because I think it would be a great way to start appreciating the challenge of breaking an ECDSA key, because writing a quantum program is nothing like writing a regular computer program. I mean, just like programming languages only follow the development of mature computers, it's the same with quantum, right? It's like, it's enormously complex. And I think the current record that we have for like I said, is 5 bits for an ECDSA key. And like, there's a great write-up on it. I'll share with you. You can link to it. Someone wrote an next post. But it's like, you could just really get an appreciation for the depth of complexity that it took just to do that, right? So anyway, there's bottom line is IBM, Google, I think, has a similar platform, Qualtran. And for the Q-Day prize, the only requirement, and qdayprize.org is where you can find all this out, but the requirement is basically like, you submit your solution, put it on GitHub so it's open sourced so everyone else can see it. And then we have a team of judges that'll independently evaluate it to ensure that it actually used one of these quantum approaches, and wasn't just, because one thing that like you could do with a quantum computer is just basically have it be a fancy random number guesser, right? Which for a 5-bit number, I mean, it's not that hard to guess a 5-bit number, right? For a 256-bit number, it'd be really hard. So we have judges to kind of make sure that whatever approach was taken is consistent with what would scale ultimately, right? So yeah, that's the Q-Day prize.
Gosh, fascinating stuff, man. I feel like we just ran through this podcast.
Yeah, it's fun.
It was fun, dude. Yeah, so just let everybody know where they can find you, where they can see you later this year if you're doing any conference tours, and then also like if they want to reach out. We just talked about the Q-Day prize. We'll link all that in the show notes. But yeah, just let everybody know where they can find you if they're interested and they want to talk to you.
Cool. Yeah, best place to find me is probably on X, aprudent08. I've got, I'm on Nostr and some other places, but I'm probably most prominent on X. So aprudent08 is where you can find me. Project11.com is where we've got a bunch of resources. So we link to the Q-Day prize we talked about. We have something called the Q-Day clock, which is basically kind of a news feed of like the latest developments in quantum computing. And we kind of, kind of meant to be like a riff on the doomsday clock. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
Yeah, I
It's
saw that. Yeah.
like how close are we to the nuclear apocalypse? It's kind of the same idea, but
Yeah.
it's like we try and only update it when like relevant stuff comes out. So that's a good way to keep pace or keep abreast of the developments of quantum computing. We have a Bitcoin at risk tracker, which basically lets you check to see if a public key has ever been exposed, right? So there's a whole list of basically the biggest public keys that, they're by value, a list of public keys that have been exposed for various wallets, hot wallets for exchanges, etc. And then we have a blog where we cover a lot of, frankly, what we've talked about on the show in great detail. Everything from like the architecture of the yellow pages to kind of wargaming the quantum adversary and everything in between. So check out those links. And then, like I said, qdayprize.org is for the Q-Day Prize specifically. And I'll be on the conference circuit, probably out to Amsterdam, possibly to Hong Kong, and then I TabConf, which is the technical Bitcoin development conference.
I'll see you at TabConf then.
Yeah, I put in a proposal to do a talk there on this topic, so hopefully that gets accepted, and if so, I'll see you and other folks there. Hopefully.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And then the other thing I was going to mention has anybody written a book about quantum that's a good like kind of starter that you would recommend for people that are interested in maybe it's development, maybe it's just like a basic kind of like or even if there's a blog or something that you would recommend, it's just like a really good kind of early, hey, here, just go read this. This will at least get you the nuts and bolts of it all.
Yeah. It's funny, like quantum computing is a lot like cryptocurrency and blockchain in this way, whereas like there's a lot of really high level resources and there's a lot of like super technical papers, and there's a huge gap in between those two things.
Okay.
So I'll send you some resources that I found helpful. Yeah. But yeah, I have not found. Short answer is I've not found a good book. Qubits for quantum. Qubits for quantum is like kind of a very high level primer. That's a decent one if you're just starting. There's a couple blogs that go into a little more detail, and I'll send you some links that you can put in the show notes potentially. But if anyone feels called to write some of this content, the world would be very appreciative, and hopefully that's something we can contribute to over time.
Yeah, so check it out on the or at least hang out on the blog, on Project 11 blog.
Yeah,
I'm sure you'll post some stuff there.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Alex. I appreciate you.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot for having me on.